Welcome to our first meeting of the Theology of the Cross. This is a discussion that I would love to be able to have a live classroom for, but I realize the importance of offering courses online. So there are 9 of you that will be participating with me in this seminar. And what I appreciate about the seminars is that we have an opportunity to do exploration for the sake of coming to a deeper understanding of a particular topic. And personally, I don't know of any topic that is more relevant to the needs of today's church, and this has always been true, of course, than a deeper understanding of the meaning of the cross. So what I'm going to do is give you a brief introductory presentation now and remind you that your first reading assignment for this week is the first 167 pages of N.T. Wright's book, The Day the Revolution Began. And I know that many of you have already begun your reading, but I also know that several of you added the class fairly, a little bit later, and so I want to give you a couple of days to do that reading. And I will post another presentation later this week, specifically focusing on that reading. And so I would ask that you would go ahead and do that. But I want to go ahead and have the course begin. Our normal course rhythm will be that I'll post a presentation at the beginning of each week, either Monday and Tuesday, over the reading that I'm asking you to do during that week. We'll have a thread of discussion that generally will be posted about Wednesday of every week, and I want that to be a lively and significant discussion. You're required to respond to at least a couple of posts, but you're encouraged to be as involved in that as possible. I've asked you about the Google group meeting, and if you've not done that before, I will be sending you an email explaining how each of you will be able to participate in that. Several of you have participated already in Google groups and have been involved in this in times past. We won't be doing that every week, but I would love for us to have question and answers in particular where we can be discussing with one another. And it's a good addition to an online class. It gives us almost, it's not quite as good as having a classroom, but a virtual classroom is better than no discussion. And so we'll probably do that at least 3 or 4 times during the semester. And it looks like Monday evenings may be our best opportunity to do that. And so we may have our first discussion next Monday evening if that works out for everyone. If for some reason you can't be a part of the Google discussion that we have because it doesn't fit your schedule, that won't hurt your participation in the course. That's just an opportunity to discuss together those things that we are reading. Now, this is an exploration course, meaning I'm as a teacher, I'm required to guide our discussion, but that doesn't mean that I'm trying to lead you to a particular conclusion. What I'd like for you to do is explore with me the meaning of the cross, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about what's piqued my interest in this and this introductory explanation of what we're trying to do as a class. You'll notice on the syllabus that I have heavily loaded the class towards your final paper. And what I really want for that to be is a fully developed understanding of the meaning of the cross. Not that we can completely understand it, but I do think that there is a disconnect between people who call themselves Christian and often even wear the symbol of the cross around their neck and in actually understanding what that means. And so this is an opportunity for us to explore the actual meaning of the cross, to get into such difficult conversations as, is there such a thing as propitiation? What does it mean to be atoned through the blood of the cross? What is the message to the world? And so we'll be looking at several texts, and I'll talk to you more about that in this introductory lecture as to why I chose the text that I did. But what I want us to consider right at the beginning is, what is the meaning of the cross in terms of how we each choose to live our lives? What does it mean for us to live out the way of the cross? And I just got back from a month of lecturing in Italy. Some of you don't know my story, and so it's not more important than yours. It's just that I'm leading the discussion here. I was born and raised in Italy to missionary parents and then moved back and worked there for quite a few years. And I've gone back almost every year to work with small churches that are scattered throughout Italy. These are Churches of Christ, or Chiese di Cristo as they are called in Italian, but I'm also working with some other evangelical groups while I'm there. And one of the things I focused on this year was really trying to explore the meaning of Paul when he talks about wanting to make sure to the Corinthians that they were not impressed by his words of wisdom, of human wisdom, but rather by the power of Christ crucified. And of course, N.T. Wright and Fleming Rutledge are both going to deal specifically with that. Green will to some extent in the third book that we'll be reading. But the understanding of the power of the example of one living the way of the cross is central to Paul's argumentation to the Corinthians. That what he's encouraging them to recognize is the distinct difference between the life that he's living and those who are opposing him. He wants them to think back on how he embodied the power of Christ crucified when he was among them. And we see how important it is for us to live the way of the cross. Or that wonderful Christ hymn in Philippians chapter 2. If you're not familiar with this text, I would encourage you to read it. But you recognize that that's not the language of Paul. It seems that he's citing a hymn. We think this is a very early Christian hymn where Paul is encouraging his readers to think about the importance of embodying the very way of life that Jesus came to offer, who even though in the form of God, and I would argue that that's a causative participle, meaning that because he was in the form of God, he emptied himself to the form of a servant, even to death on the cross. Therefore, he was highly exalted. And so part of what we want to consider is the human experience of trying to find meaning in the world. And how are we going to find that meaning? I think all humankind wants to experience being exalted. I don't know how many of you are interested in this, but here we are in a city in the South, in Nashville, Tennessee, that's just gone nuts over ice hockey. I mean, go figure, right? But it's this deep desire to be a part of something greater than yourself. And you have an entire community united around a game that most people have never even watched, much less played, because they feel like they're part of something that's winning. Well, I think there's something within each one of us that gives us a deep desire to be exalted. And the question is, are we going to pursue that exaltation through the ways of the world or through that which Paul calls the very model of how to live a life successfully? And so what I'm suggesting at the very beginning of our study is that the meaning of the cross goes much deeper than something that God has done to make us right with him, but it's actually an invitation to a kind of life. And what I want you to consider as you begin to work towards your final paper in this class, which, by the way, I'm encouraging you to start as you go. This is not something you have to get done studying with and then craft this perfect paper. I want you to develop questions that you feel like need to be answered, especially within the context of the ministry that you're currently involved in. What does the church need to hear about the meaning of the cross? Not as something done external that they can reflect on as something like a past event, but is it something actually that calls us into an actual way of being? And then I want us to consider, what does it mean to appropriate the cross, especially in terms of how Paul phrases this in the Galatian correspondence when he says, I have been crucified with Christ. And I think, again, this is his baptismal hymn. If you look at the language in Colossians chapter 2, how he refers to baptism as a participation in the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, that I think his argumentation in Galatians is that I have participated in this dramatic portrayal of being crucified with Christ, so that it's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. In the life that I now live, I live by faith in the Son of God, who gave himself up for me. So he's referring to the cross as a way of life. And so we want to unpack what that looks like, not just for individuals, but as a community of people who are dedicated to demonstrating to the world this incredible way of life that is uniquely Christian. And so we're asking the question, what is the relationship of the church and the Christian to the cross of Jesus? What impact does it have on our lives? How is it that we live out our lives, not only as individuals, but as communities of faith reflecting the meaning of the cross? So what does it mean, in that very central core teaching of the Christian faith, to deny oneself, pick up their cross daily, and follow Jesus? What does that look like in the context of everyday life? And so this is what I'm asking you to think about as ministers and as teachers of the Word. How can you encourage individuals to see the cross as not just a symbol of salvation received, but as a way of life? And so it would be very easy to spend our entire time together reflecting on the meaning of the cross as has been portrayed by others. But here, let's just look at a few quotes to recognize how central this discussion is. Oswald Chamber, who is well known for his book, My Utmost for His Highest, is comments that the heart of salvation is the cross of Christ. The reason salvation is so easy to obtain is that it cost God so much. The cross was the place where God and sinful man merged with a tremendous collision and where the way to life was opened. But all the cost and pain of the collision are absorbed by the heart of God. The only thing I would call into question here is he's Oswald Chambers here is trying to point out the importance of this moment. But I would argue that salvation is not as much easy as we sometimes portray it. Not that we earn in any way our salvation. This is God's grace, but it does call for a response on our part of what Paul talks about in Romans chapter 12. I urge you, therefore, by the mercies of God, to present yourselves as a living sacrifice. This is not easy. Now, God is the one who's done the work, but he calls us to a reflection of the cross that is much deeper than just simply accepting it. Dietrich Bonhoeffer talks about the deep meaning of the cross of Christ is that there is no suffering on earth that is not borne by God, which is such an important idea that the cross not only gives us a sense of our salvation, but has a very important aspect, and N.T. Wright's going to point this out, as well Fleming Rutledge, is how important it is for us to understand the participation of God in giving his son to die for us. Now we have to understand this, because if we don't, it seems that God is almost a child abuser, and that he sends his own son to die to satisfy his own wrath. I think we need to come to a better understanding of the cross and the relationship of the cross to this gift of salvation, and also what it might mean as it pertains to human suffering. Jürgen Moltmann said it's in the cross of Christ that God is taking humankind dead seriously, so that he may open up for humankind the happy freedom of Easter. God takes upon God's self the pain of negotiation and the God of forsakenness of judgment to reconcile himself with his enemies and to give the godless fellowship with himself. Now, there's a lot to unpack there. But what Jürgen Moltmann points out in a lot of his writings is that this is a participation of God as a free gift to humanity to give us life. And Amy Carmichael then says, when I consider the cross of Christ, how can I do anything, or how can anything I do be called sacrifice? In other words, the incredible cost that this was for God. What does that call me to in terms of the response of my life? And then Martin Luther King Jr., Christianity has always insisted that the cross we bear precedes the crown we wear. And that's a really important idea. That is, if we're not willing to bear the cross, then there is no crown. There is no exaltation for those who refuse to die. And how he showed that in amazing ways in sacrificing his life for the good of others. And then Hudson Taylor, the famous British missionary, says carrying the cross does mean following in Jesus' footsteps. And in his footsteps are rejection, brokenheartedness, persecution, and death. There are not two Christs, an easygoing one for easygoing Christians and a suffering one for exceptional believers. There's only one Christ. Are we willing to follow his lead? So when you think about all the artwork that's been done through the years on the cross of Christ, and of course this is the image for which Christianity is known. It is the image in which we most often see Christ portrayed, is hanging on the cross. We know of famous crucifixes all over the world. Even in my office, I have several representations of the cross. It has such a powerful meaning. But I have to say personally, one of my favorite artworks depicting the cross is Salvador Dali's Christ of St. John of the Cross. This was a painting that he did in 1951, and I had the opportunity to see this in Glasgow. And I don't remember, Zach, if you were on that trip or not. Zach Brantley is in this course, and he's traveled with me to Scotland, but one year we had an opportunity to go to the museum where it was housed. And I remember walking into the room and seeing it's quite large, but just being taken by the power of the image. And of course, Dali is one of the great Spanish surrealists who doesn't just paint in order to depict a scene, but to convey deep meaning. And so it's pretty interesting when you recognize what he's done. It's based on a 16th century drawing by John of the Cross. That's why the painting is named as it is. But it's interesting to hear, what Dali's own explanation. He talks about the triangle between the back and the cross that represents the Trinity and the circle of life that's continued. But the idea of the power of the sacrifice hanging over just the commonplace port. This is the port in Spain where Salvador Dali was born, so it's his hometown. He's trying to express the cosmic meaning of God uniting himself with humankind in a way that changes just the very ordinary circumstances of life. But what I want us to do is, as we go through the course, is to stop and spend time in contemplation. And if you have a particular image of the cross that is meaningful to you, we'll talk about that a little bit later in the semester. But I would be interested in knowing what that might be, in coming to understand the power, not only of what Jesus did for me, but the power of the invitation that we have to participate in that sacrifice. Dali says that he has this cosmic dream in which he saw this image in color, in which my dream represented the nucleus of the atom. This nucleus later took on a metaphysical sense. I considered it to be the very unity of the universe, the Christ. And one of the reasons I find this so compelling is that some of the things that I'm studying right now for another writing project that I'm involved in is actually considering the behavior of subatomic particles and taking into consideration quantum physics, where you have these infinitesimally small subatomic particles that no longer react to Newtonian physics as we have understood it. And so that what you have is an incredible relationship of energy at a subatomic level. And so that what Dali is referring to, without really having that scientific knowledge, is that somehow the cross symbolizes that which holds the universe together, and that without the cross, the universe would have no meaning and purpose. So, this leads us then to a consideration of the purpose of this course, is to ask the question, what does the cross mean to you? And one of the things, of course, that N.T. Wright's going to take on, as well as the other writers, is the inappropriate way in which we have assumed that the cross was something for us as individuals and not recognized its cosmic significance. I have often used Michael Goheen's book, A Light to the Nations. Some of you have taken my class in Missional Strategies. You've read this book. But this is really the beginning of this seminar, was when Goheen raised the question in his book, A Light to the Nations, which, by the way, if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. It's one of the better works of pulling together the entire biblical story in a continuing narrative. But he talks about the importance of recognizing the meaning of the cross and how it connects to the church in ways that the church has not fully understood. And so that's what led to the idea of this would be a great topic to consider. What does it mean to see the cross as something that is intrinsic, not just to what God has done, but to who we actually are. And so what we're going to do in this course then is to read 3 of many possible texts, as I've mentioned. And I want us to understand the reading that I'm assigning you is not for you to agree with, but to raise questions. I'm asking you to dialogue with N.T. Wright and Fleming Rutledge and Green and Baker in their book, The Scandal of the Cross, and recovering the scandal of the cross, recognizing what that might mean to our lives. So, one of the things that I found myself aware of is that whenever you select certain text, you're also excluding other texts. But my main purpose in selecting the text that I did was to discuss and learn in community, that is, this community that we now have, there's 10 of us that are participating in this, developing a fully functional theology of the cross. So that we're asking the question, what does the cross actually mean? So I want to take you then to Michael Goheen's book for just a moment and take into consideration the three problems that Goheen raises in terms of the relationship of the church to the cross. The first being way too little attention to the narrative context of the crucifixion accounts, that is, the redemptive, historical, and literary contexts. That is, we don't see the cross within the context of the entire story, which begins from creation and ends in new creation. We tend to see the cross as being an isolated event where God takes care of all of our problems and then leaves us in our stories. And so, what Goheen wants to do is to reverse the tendency that we have to shift the meaning of the cross to something that's individual and returning it to its cosmic significance and recognizing it within the context of the larger story. And because we have had a tendency to de-emphasize the communal and cosmic significance of atonement. Crucifixion in its fullest sense reveals and accomplishes renewal of the entire cosmos. So something happened at the cross, and if you've already read through The Day the Revolution Began, the book is worth the conclusion. Now don't cheat and go there first, but it will be worth the journey to get to the conclusion of the book, because I think N.T. Wright does the best job that I've seen so far of any book that I've read on the cross, of bringing it into what it means in terms of how we live. And for some of us, it's going to be very uncomfortable because it flies in the face of a lot of the cultural uh, attitudes that we have developed, especially in the United States. So the third issue that Goheen brings up is the idea of neglecting the message of the transforming power of the cross, meaning we don't expect the cross to necessarily change people. Now, when I say that, that's a general statement, and I don't mean to indict anyone. But the idea is when we think about what baptism should symbolize, it's a participation in the Christ event. You're dying to self, you're being buried to be raised to a new reality. But we tend to, and maybe this doesn't describe your church at all, but in the churches of which I've been a part and work with, there's not much of an expected response. So we tend to say I'm forgiven and justified, but we don't necessarily expect anything to be different. And so what we need to dig into is what should the meaning of the cross be in terms of the implications of my everyday life. And so I want to read a quote to you from page 104 of The Light to the Nations. This is Goheen. He says, "Our understanding of the cross is conditioned by the questions we ask." And so here, let me insert a comment here. That's why I'm very concerned about developing the right questions. So that's what we'll be working with over these weeks as we develop different questions each week. And it's not that we're going to come to specific and very satisfying answers, but we've got to have the right questions, because if we go to the cross with the wrong questions, we can't come away with right answers. So he says, our understanding of the cross is conditioned by the questions we ask. If we ask, how can I, as an individual person, be forgiven and obtain eternal life, even if I'm a sinner and deserve to be punished? Then the answer will be, well, because Jesus has died in my place. But if we ask, how can God renew the entirety of the creation and the whole of human life from the pollution of human sin? Then the answer would be, because on the cross Jesus took the power and guilt of sin upon himself, and in so doing defeated the power of sin and evil that threatened to destroy it. Again, if we ask, how can God create a new community that already anticipates and embodies the life of the coming kingdom of God? Then the answer will be, because in the death of Jesus, God has acted to conquer the evil that has so corrupted the life of humankind since the time of Adam. Now, I don't know about you, but that's a much different understanding of the cross than I was exposed to, especially in the years in which I was coming to understand what Jesus had done for me. That there is a deeper meaning of the cross than we sometimes allow for. And we also need to understand that much of the questions that we have asked may not be the right question. Because again, I think the question that is most often asked is what Goheen points out is, how can I as an individual be forgiven and obtain eternal life? But what the question is, how is God going to reconcile the world to himself through the blood of the cross? Colossians chapter 1 and verse 19 through 21. Look at that story. It really begins in verse 15 and goes through 21. But that it's the cross event that actually gives us a whole new identity in the world. So part of the questions we'll be asking, and actually we're going to ask this one right away because this is, in my opinion, some of the best work that N.T. Wright does. And that's that he allows Paul to be Paul and not a post Reformation theologian. That's what's happened. I think that much of what Paul talks about in terms of propitiation, in terms of the wrath of God, in terms of justification, that the reformers did their best to try to recover the meaning of that. But many of them did not recognize the Jewish um, environment of Paul as a Pharisee, how Paul would have seen the cross as a Pharisee. And it wasn't so much sort of a mechanical formula, but rather an identity with the actual shame and scandal of the cross. That's a part of the salvific process. So part of what we're going to ask is that we take a different read on Paul. To that end, some of you were with me in research that we did where we looked at Michael Gorman's book, Becoming the Gospel, subtitled Paul, Participation and Mission. If you have more interest in this than we're going to be able to quench in this discussion, of the last couple of years, I think this book was the most formative book I've read in terms of my better understanding Paul. Now, I've read the 4-volume work of N.T. Wright on Paul, and that was very helpful, but it's also exhaustive. And I do mean exhaustive. That's a lot of pages. What Michael Gorman does, in a sense, is that he condenses much of what N.T. Wright does and gives you a book that is very accessible, at least to those of you who studied theology, but gives us a whole different way of seeing Paul, which I think is essential to understanding the cross of Christ. So what we need to recognize is that many of the theories of atonement are post-restoration Enlightenment constructs. And so part of what N.T. Wright in particular is trying to do, and Fleming Rutledge to some extent, is trying to unpack some of the influence that some of the Reform and post-Reform Reformation writers have had on our understanding, for instance, of substitutionary atonement and similar understandings. So what about the classic works on the cross? Why have I chosen these particular works? And again, I want to remind you that in no way do I want to diminish these works. And here's a list of works that I easily could have chosen. John Stott's The Cross of Christ. I think I would have identified this as my favorite treatment of the cross before reading the books that we'll be reading in this class. It had a very helpful influence on me. It's probably the most read book in the last 100 years or so on the idea of the cross of Christ, written by John Stott. Of course, John Calvin's 2-volume Institute of Christian Religion has had a tremendous influence on the thinking of the theology of the cross in all of Christian thought, but particularly Protestant religious thought. Frederick Lay's The Cross He Bore is very powerful in terms of describing what Christ has done for us. R.C. Sproul's The Truth of the Cross is mentioned by a lot of individuals as having had an amazing impact on them. And Sproul does a really good job of starting to dig into the idea of participating in that story. Mahaney's Living the Cross-Centered Life is a very challenging book, calling readers to authentic discipleship, which by its very nature means sacrifice. And then Martin Lloyd Jones's The Cross. And there may be a lot of other books that you have read or you've been influenced by that refer to the cross. But these are generally the books that will show up on favorite lists. And I would recommend that at some point you consider reading at least some of these, if not all of these. But as you have an opportunity to dig more fully into this topic, I would highly recommend all of these books. And I could have chosen any of them, but I did have a specific reason for us choosing the 3 books that we chose, because I do think they raise questions. Okay, N.T. Wright is going to give us a much deeper understanding of the narrative and Paul as he would have seen it. Now, this is from his point of view, but I think it's a very challenging and helpful look. Fleming Rutledge is going to be pretty exhaustive in her digging into the actual theories of atonement. And that's going to be the densest reading that we do. It's highly theological, but it's work that I think needs to be done. And then I think you'll find in in Joel Green and Mark Baker's work, a good practical understanding of how this plays out, and particularly at the very end, we'll look at how to effectively preach atonement today. I want to remind you, I'm not asking you to agree with these authors. I'm asking you to consider what they have to say as we work toward a theology of the cross. And let me explain in closing our introduction that this is a wide open exploration. I have no intention on telling you what you should think about the cross. I want us to work together toward a discovery where we may have significant differences at the end of the journey. But what's important is that we take the journey together and understand together the possible implications of the cross. So again, I'm not asking you to agree with me, but I am asking you to consider how we might more appropriately recognize the power of the cross in the context of the church. And so I look forward to this adventure together. I will plan on either Thursday or Friday of this week posting a brief discussion. It'll be briefer this time because each what we need to do to fulfill the requirements of the course is I'll give you an hour or an hour and a half of material each week in addition to your reading. Now remember, your reading is an important part of the class, but it's not individual reading. You're reading within the community as we study, and so your thread of discussion will be focused on your reading so that you can have some discussion there. And then if we have 3 or 4 Google group meetings, I think this can be a very, very helpful course. So let me know if you have questions. I look forward to the continuation.